Hello, I'm Dr. Brendan Mulvaney, the Director of the China Aerospace Studies Institute. Welcome back to our video series on competition with China. In this video, we're going to be discussing the strategic perspective of the People's Republic of China. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the different tiers of issues that the PRC views as threatening to their regime. These threats could be either internal or external, but they all have an impact on the way the Chinese Communist Party and its leaders see and react to the world. Dr. Joel Wuthnow is a Senior Research Fellow at the Center for the Study of Chinese Military Affairs at National Defense University. Today, he's going to walk us through the different threats, threat levels, and some of the possible implications for how the PRC, the CCP, and the PLA may react to those threats.
Imagine for a moment that you are Xi Jinping, sitting in central Beijing and looking out across the strategic landscape. What would be your biggest concerns? What would be the proverbial 3 a.m. phone call you dread the most? And how would these perceptions influence your guidance to the armed forces and China's security apparatus writ large? We can't get inside Xi's head, of course, but we can offer some perspective on the range of security challenges that China's leadership faces. In this lecture, I'll describe some of those challenges at 3 levels: domestic, regional, and global. And along the way, I'll consider some of the ways in which these problems influence the roles and missions of the PLA. So if you're Xi, the most immediate problems are right on your doorstep. The first thing you need to consider as the leader of the Chinese Communist Party is whether any rival power centers are developing within the party. There have been attempted coups in the past, and the history of Leninist regimes in other countries provides a number of concerning examples, including the 1991 Soviet military coup. Xi is aware of all that history. This means, first and foremost, that you need to take steps to increase your own authority in the regime and over the PLA, which Xi has done in several ways, such as using anti-corruption charges to intimidate his political opponents and removing term limits so that he can rule past the normal 10-year period. He has also encouraged something of a cult of personality within the military and burnished his influence as chairman of the Central Military Commission through key personnel appointments. Beyond this, there are also a number of domestic challenges that could damage the party's leadership and threaten to weaken its control over Chinese territory. First are large-scale social movements directed against the party. China has had many protests over the years, often focused on social and economic grievances and corruption, as well as more specialized concerns like environmental activism and protests by veterans who haven't received their pensions. Most of these are at the local level, but a few have bubbled up to the national level. Most famous is the 1989 Tiananmen movement. The Falun Gong demonstration in Beijing in 1999 is another example. The party has taken steps to diffuse or control these movements, including controlling the spread of information on the internet and social media platforms and strictly limiting the development of civil society in China. But you need a strong and loyal armed force to be able to act quickly if small protests ever do coalesce into broader complaints against the regime. This implies a continuing mission for the armed forces in internal security, a role they played during the 1989 Tiananmen crackdown. Territorial control cannot be taken for granted either. Vast areas of Western China are populated primarily by Uyghur and Tibetan groups who historically have not been part of China, and many of whom want either autonomy or independence from the CCP. As recently as 2008, large protests erupted in both places. China has adopted repressive policies to control these populations, including what they call re-education camps for Uyghurs in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, and strict rules governing religious practice. The PLA and its paramilitary cousin, the People's Armed Police, are in Western China in force to deter opposition to the regime and respond if tensions erupt again. The armed forces are also needed for smaller-scale acts of terrorism by separatist groups or others, which could take place in China's far west or in major metropolitan areas in the east. The PLA and the People's Armed Police have thus sharpened their counterterrorism skills over the years. Finally, there are periodic large-scale natural and humanitarian disasters. China is prone to major earthquakes, including the 2008 Sichuan earthquake that claimed 87,000 lives, flooding, and man-made disasters such as industrial accidents. Most recently, they faced the COVID-19 pandemic in the central metropolis of Wuhan. China's civilian emergency management system is still developing, which means that the PLA continues to play an important role. In the COVID response case, for instance, the PLA had to be dispatched not only to provide medical treatment, but also to enforce social control, keeping society on lockdown while the pandemic threatened to spread across the whole country. So once you, as China's preeminent leader, have domestic problems under control, you can turn your attention to the rest of the region. At the top of the list is Taiwan. The root of the problem stretches back to 1949, when the Kuomintang, which previously controlled the mainland, lost the Chinese Civil War and fled to the island of Taiwan, where they governed for decades as an authoritarian regime before democratic presidential elections were held in 1996. The CCP regards Taiwan as a renegade breakaway province. They have told the Chinese people that they will recover the island and indicated that this needs to be complete as part of what the party calls national rejuvenation by 2049. But so far, they've failed. Taiwan has developed into a flourishing democracy with support for unification with the mainland at an all-time low. As China's leader, you have to decide whether to risk a war to achieve unification, a war that could draw in the United States and threaten severe economic and military costs, with the prospect of victory not guaranteed. If you don't act, the problem will continue, and history may render a negative verdict on your leadership. And if you do act and lose, then your personal political survival may be at stake. From a military perspective, you need to be able to exert constant pressure on Taiwan so that they aren't tempted to pursue formal independence and so that they think seriously about coming back to the negotiating table. The PLA has indeed been doing this through aggressive maneuvers in the maritime areas and airspace near Taiwan. If you choose to solve the issue through force, the PLA needs to be able to quickly cross the Taiwan Strait and occupy the island, preferably before the United States can mobilize and come to Taiwan's assistance. This is thus a problem that occupies much attention by the PLA and by China's leadership. Aside from dealing with Taiwan, you also have to worry about the rest of the region. China shares borders with 14 other countries. Simply defending Chinese borders across an extensive periphery can be a challenge when many of those borders are in remote and poorly governed areas. Examples include China's border with Afghanistan and throughout Southeast Asia, where Beijing worries about transnational criminal activity. This ranges from Islamic terrorism to drug and human trafficking, and even piracy along transborder rivers. What this means is that the PLA has a very significant border defense mission. In several cases, China also has unresolved territorial disputes with its neighbors. On land, while China managed to resolve many disputes in the 1980s and 1990s, the border dispute with India remains unresolved. The two sides disagree on where the border is actually located in 3 separate areas, covering thousands of square miles of territory. In 1962, the two sides fought a bloody war that resulted in China firming up its control in one of these regions. Since then, there have been periodic tensions and even deadly clashes as recently as May 2020. The other land border dispute is with the tiny kingdom of Bhutan, which occupies a strategic position in the Himalayas and has become something of a battleground for influence between China and India. At sea, China has a long-standing dispute with Japan in the East China Sea over the ownership of the Senkaku Islands. This is both a matter of nationalism, but also influences who can tap into the significant oil and natural gas resources in the East China Sea. In the South China Sea, China faces opposing territorial claims from 4 other states: Malaysia, Brunei, the Philippines, and Vietnam. The Philippines and Vietnam both have a military presence that has become an obstacle for China to consolidate its ability to control maritime traffic in a sweeping area bounded by what they call the 9-dash line. China's claims are again important for nationalist and economic reasons. China has much at stake in terms of fisheries and seeks to explore and develop energy resources, including in areas relatively close to Vietnam. In July 2016, a UN Court of Arbitration ruled that China's claims are illicit, but Beijing has persisted nonetheless. Pressing all these territorial claims puts pressure on the Chinese armed forces to be able to deter what they see as aggressive moves by other claimants. It also requires the PLA, as well as other parts of China's security apparatus, including the China Coast Guard and the Maritime Militia, which are armed fishing fleets, to be able to patrol these large areas and intimidate anyone else who threatens to operate there without China's consent. And yet none of this represents the most serious strategic challenge for China in the region. That challenge comes not from a neighbor, but from the United States. When Xi looks out across the Pacific, the US looms large both as an opportunity in terms of trade and investment, but increasingly as a strategic adversary. For decades, Chinese observers have seen the US carrying out a strategic plot to encircle and weaken China. The US, of course, did have a strategy of containment during the Cold War. This was intended to prevent communist expansionism into Asia by Mao, who intervened in Korea and funded communist insurgent movements in Southeast Asia. Although the context has dramatically changed since then, Chinese leaders continue to conclude that the fundamental aim of US policy in Asia is to prevent China from accumulating wealth and power, and thus threatening the hegemonic position of the US in the regional order. They see Washington doing this in many ways: sanctions, and more recently trade wars, fomenting dissent inside China's borders, slandering China on the world stage, and encouraging China's territorial rivals to act more brazenly than they would have done otherwise. Bringing US alliances and partnerships together into a wider network, such as the US, Japan, India, Australia quadrilateral security dialogue, seem to a Chinese audience as the manifestation of a campaign to strategically encircle China. Militarily, they perceive US alliances, especially the US-Japan alliance, as designed to put pressure on China, and US bases in South Korea and all along the first and second island chains as launching points for provocative military operations around China's maritime periphery. And the worst offense of all is providing political military support to Taiwan, which they argue emboldens independence activists and makes the job of coercing Taiwan to the negotiating table all the more difficult. China's response to the US is multifaceted. A lot of weight is placed on leveraging economic advantage, securing support from others in the region by tolerating trade deficits or through investments, or by using economic sticks, such as trade embargoes, when those countries adopt policies too close to the United States. An example was Beijing's punishment of South Korea for its decision to host a US missile defense battery in 2017. Yet the PLA also comes into play. The Chinese military needs to be able to challenge US military operations near its coasts, which entails PLA naval and air intercepts. They also need to be able to hold US bases and other assets, including aircraft carriers, at risk through long-range precision strike. The goal is to raise the stakes for US military presence in Asia and to deter US intervention on behalf of an ally or Taiwan. Xi hopes that will work and that the PLA will never need to fight an actual war with the United States, but it needs to be able to fight and win if deterrence fails. So once you survey the domestic and regional landscape with all the dangers and threats contained across China's vast periphery, then you can turn your attention to the rest of the world. Here, there are 2 major security challenges, one tangible and one intangible. The tangible challenge for China beyond Asia concerns threats to its economic interests. Since the early 1990s, China has gone out in search of economic opportunities, including opening new markets, securing critical raw materials, and most recently, building large-scale infrastructure projects through the Belt and Road Initiative. These activities bring economic opportunities to China, but also incur security risks. The most obvious risk concerns threats to China's overseas energy imports. Since 1993, China has been a net importer of oil. Most of this comes from the Middle East, and up to 80% travels through the maritime choke point of the Strait of Malacca. Xi's predecessor, Hu Jintao, famously referred to this as the Malacca dilemma. China needs the oil, but is vulnerable to interdiction by an enemy such as the US Navy in times of crisis. China also has to be able to protect threats against other Chinese commercial shipping and against Chinese nationals and assets abroad. This includes terrorist threats, natural disasters, and people caught up in civil conflict. In 2011, China had to evacuate more than 35,000 of its own citizens during the civil war in Libya. Many of China's BRI projects are located in dangerous places, such as the Baluchistan province of Pakistan, where Chinese workers have been targeted. What this means for the PLA is that the Navy needs to be able to operate farther from China's shores to protect critical sea lanes and potentially to facilitate large-scale non-combatant evacuations. The other security services, as well as new actors such as private security companies, need to be on call to protect Chinese workers and assets abroad, sometimes in concert with host governments. The intangible challenge has to do with China's reputation. Beijing seeks a positive image in the developing world for diplomatic reasons and to facilitate economic deals. It is wary about narratives that cast China and the CCP in a negative light, what they call the China threat theory. One example concerns foreign perceptions of the BRI as predatory and exploitative. This is a narrative that doesn't comport with their own argument of China as seeking win-win cooperation. Xi Jinping and other Chinese leaders work strongly on the diplomatic circuit to reject these assertions. The military comes into play to support that diplomatic work in various ways. For instance, PLA attachés worldwide support China's positive narrative. Military activities, such as China's participation in United Nations peacekeeping missions in Africa and the Middle East, and the Navy's anti-piracy missions in the Gulf of Aden, are also used to construe China in a more positive light. So as you canvass the strategic landscape, there is a lot to worry about, starting with discontent at home, to challenges posed by pernicious neighbors and the United States in Asia, and ending with more diffuse threats to China's global interests. It is no wonder that Xi, since he came to power in November 2012, has often spoken of a holistic security concept defined by a multitude of threats and challenges that need to be taken as a whole. He talks in particular about linkages between domestic and external threats and about challenges that bleed across domains. For instance, economic challenges that then become problems of social order. The implication has been a move to strengthen Xi's position as leader of the CCP, policies to strengthen social control at home, and a continued drive to build the PLA into a world-class military defined by cutting-edge technology. With greater capabilities, Xi has allowed the military and the paramilitary services to conduct more frequent and provocative operations to deter and intimidate adversaries and demonstrate for a domestic audience that the party under his leadership is protecting China's interests in an increasingly dangerous world. Yet, Xi has also been something of a pragmatist. He has generally avoided the use of lethal force against other nations and seems to be cautious about getting into an escalating conflict with the United States. He also has tried to use economic inducements and high-level diplomacy to diffuse tensions and enlist friends, often against the US. What would Xi's worst-case scenario as he sits in Beijing, the 3 a.m. phone call that he fears the most, would be a cascade of multiple crises, bleeding across multiple regions and involving multiple antagonists that escape the party's ability to handle and that would bring his leadership into question and potentially his regime to an end.